At Viziki, I am the comms nerd, and I also drive customer success. As a professional in PR, my pet peeve is the countless hours we put into derive meaningful information from the tons of coverage on us, on our competition, etc. Sometimes I have spent time till late in the night just counting coverage. I know it's been many, many years back, but it still peeves me. So Viziki is a software built to solve this. The media intelligence and the reporting needs of brands, people like you and me. We believe that impactful campaigns can come from data-driven approach, and it can deliver some real brand outcomes. So with that, I welcome Sarah. Sarah, welcome to the webinar. I know Sarah as a powerhouse of ideas, of creative ideas, especially the work that she's done at Uber and blockchain is incredible and very inspirational. We are lucky, Sarah, that you were an early user of Viziki and you chose to invest in us and became our first US investor. And thank you so much for that. And thank you for joining us today. I also welcome Caitlin. Caitlin created inspirational work at Twilio. We can talk tons and tons about it. Twilio is such an amazing brand and it needs no introduction. And I'm just in awe of what you're able to achieve globally with your teams. So with that, over to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Akriti. I'm so excited to be here today and be joined by Caitlin. Caitlin is the Senior Director of PR at Twilio, where her team is responsible for corporate and product PR and media relations, as well as thought leadership for the Twilio exec team. She started her career at Hotwire PR, formerly Eastwick Communications, and that's where she really became passionate about storytelling and really loved the challenge of taking on techie enterprise stories and finding that human interest narrative behind it, which is not easy to do. I'm thrilled to have her join us today and give us a masterclass on thought leadership. So welcome, Caitlin.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so I think what we'll do is we'll dive in. I'd love to just, have a conversation with you, talk a little bit about, the evolution of thought leadership at Twilio since you have been there for 6 years. We will do a couple of polls to kind of gauge the audience's experience in thought leadership and understand kind of where they're at, and then answer some questions that the audience might have a little bit later. So with that, why don't you, so you've been at Twilio for 6 years, kind of talk us through your experience.
Sure. So I joined Twilio in 2015. We were still a private company. We were about 350 employees, maybe less than 100 million in revenue a year. And at that point I joined, and really my charter was just to partner up with the director of PR at the time and get brand awareness for the company and to build out our CEO's program as we headed towards an IPO. So we had an IPO in 2016, which we were the first tech company to go public that year in June, which was great for PR because everyone wanted to know what was going on in the market. We were the first one to sort of test it out. That sort of put us on the map. And then after that, things really changed because private company PR and public company PR is pretty different. You kind of go from brand awareness at all costs. You'll take any possible opportunity to do a story or get out there, and you have to start being a little bit more strategic about that. So over the years, it's been really fun just on this ride with the company. We're now, I think, over 7,000 employees, and my team is 8, and I also run social media as well. And I still do a lot of Jeff, our CEO's executive PR and comms. So it's been really fun just building out the program there. But the company has definitely grown a lot since I started.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that is such an amazing arc. So how has thought leadership, pre-IPO, IPO, post-IPO, what has thought leadership kind of looked like, and how has it evolved as the company has grown from 300 to 7,000?
I think we've become a lot more intentional about it. When you're smaller, especially when you're doing startup PR, it's harder to get your story out there because less people know your name, and it's not as, everyone doesn't know you. And so when you have an opportunity, you don't turn it down. And so we've definitely, at this point, we evaluate our opportunities that come to us or the ones we pitch more clearly. And we're really looking at through 3 vectors, does this press story or this opportunity or speaking or whatever the thing is, Is it help us tell our mission to the world and really articulate that story? That's one thing I'm asking. Secondly, we call it brand halo, and that's any kind of opportunity or story that lets us really show how Twilio is a force for good in the world and how we are that way as an employer. Does it fit under that? Or lastly, like, is it one of the social issues that we are passionate about as a company or one of our executives is passionate about? And so if it fits under one of those, that's the kind of opportunities we take on at this point. I think when we were younger in our journey, brand awareness is so critical. You'll take on a lot different kind of opportunities. So that's sort of how it's changed. Now I think we're a bit more intentional.
Yeah, that's amazing. And you can see it too, as the types of stories and narratives that you kind of see out there. You do definitely see that intention, which is really nice. It shows that, we've been working hard and it's definitely resonating. We're going to talk a lot today about what thought leadership is, but I thought that maybe right before we do that, we should probably clear up like what it isn't. So what, in your opinion, what is not considered thought leadership?
Yeah. It's funny because when you ask this question, I'm like, let me think about that. I think what is not considered thought leadership is, when I think of thought leadership, it's anything that's not the company announcement. Like if you're doing a formal press release on a product announcement or a new executive or something, that's less of a thought leadership topic. And then you may have a thought leadership element to that, but it's really the work you do in PR outside of the formal company line or the formal company announcement. And when I think about it, or what my team, I think, has done a really good job at, and it's because we all love storytelling, is like, we're trying to think about how you put forward an executive or a spokesperson and tell their personal story and have that executive give their perspective or their point of view on either, something macro going on in the economy, whether it's a trend going on in the tech industry, or like our point of view on a specific topic. And that's what thought leadership really is to us. It's not the formal announcements we're making, it's all the work we're doing around that to really give the company a soul and show our perspectives and point of view. And for us, it's really putting the human forward to show who we really are, who's behind the tech, that's not the tech.
Yeah, that's so important. Do you find that balance has sort of changed over the years? There's been consistent, like going from the more kind of like formal business announcements versus thought leadership? Like, is it 50-50? Is it 80-20?
I would love to know exactly. I think sometimes when you're younger, you almost have to do more of the thought leadership because you have less of the news. Like as we've grown bigger, the company scales and you have more opportunities to tell bigger stories. You have more customer announcements, you have your executive bench grows, you have more products, more milestones to sort of share in a more formal way. So I think when you're young, it's important at every single stage. When you're earlier in your company, you do have to still tell those stories because sometimes that's how you break through the noise. Like, do you have an executive who has a super provocative or controversial opinion? That may be a way if you don't have news to get out there. So I don't know what our exact breakdown is. It's maybe it's 50-50 at this point. Probably when we were younger, we leaned more towards thought leadership even than now.
I mean, that's understandable because when you're young, you want to build credibility for your brand. And the best thing you can do that is to put up one of your executives, if not usually your CEO and co-founder, which actually leads me to my next question. So like your CEO and co-founder, so Jeff, he is your best storyteller, right? And how have you effectively leveraged him with the media, and kind of what has that sort of looked like over the years? Because I know in my experience, when I've worked with tech execs or tech CEOs, they're very reluctant and worried about overexposure, and they get very tired about being like the primary spokesperson. So I'm just sort of curious, I find that Jeff's very good at PR, like your Jeff is really good at PR. And I'd love to sort of get your perspective on what his relationship to it is and how you guys have approached it.
It's funny because you're right. A lot of especially when we've been really lucky with Jeff. I think he understood PR pretty early on. Definitely now he understands the impact. In the early days, he had to do everything. Like every product announcement, Jeff was our spokesperson through our IPO, honestly. And then we started really building out the bench. And now he speaks more. He's usually the first person a reporter will request to speak with, but sometimes we have other people as the company's grown that have better expertise in certain topics. But we still use him whenever we're talking about the vision and or when it's a particular topic that he's passionate about. I think what's a common thing you hear, I've consulted with a few startups and the CEOs often will say like, no one wants to know my story. Like no one knows me, no one cares about me. Like, let's let the product speak for itself. And I always say like, it's not going to speak to itself, especially if you're an enterprise or B2B tech, like the human story is so important. And I think that's a very common thing you hear from like earlier on in your PR journey from executives, like no one cares about my story, but that's what I always say. I'm like, everyone, this is what people care about. Like humans want to hear about other humans and want to hear point of views. So like, we're always trying to push our spokespeople to speak more. And I think that's very important lesson to learn early on and kind of push your founder on or your CEO. Jeff's been great though. I mean, he understands PR. He's a great storyteller, but he's also invested a ton of time in becoming that kind of storyteller, doing some of his own coaching. I remember one of my first meetings with him, he's like, have you read Made to Stick, which is this book by Chip and Dan Heath that's about how to tell a compelling story and be convincing. And that's something he always wants everyone at Twilio to read. Whatever team you're on, he's like, everyone should know how to tell the story. So I think I've been very lucky to have a leader who is a great storyteller and understands the value of PR, but I think it came over time. Like we definitely had to prove that we could do the work and then it would have impact. So that's always critical.
Yeah, no, definitely. I find that it's one of those things that you kind of can't explain. You're like, we promise if you invest in this, like it will be worth it. It's not immediate, and so, we'll get to that in a little bit in terms of how you measure and what that sort of looks like in terms of being able to demonstrate success and thought leadership. But I totally hear you. Well, so speaking on that sort of, great stories do have a human element to them, and so often in tech they do want to have the product kind of lead, but that's not the most interesting or sort of part that resonates. You were telling me earlier about this example with your merger with SendGrid, the $3 billion breakfast burrito, and I love that. And so I would love for you to share kind of the backstory of that and sort of where that came from and how highlights like a good example of thought leadership in this case with two executives, two CEOs.
Yeah, this is probably my favorite story I've ever worked on, and I did it in collaboration with the SendGrid PR team at the time, who's now on my team. But basically, when you do an acquisition, you first announce the deal and then the deal closes several months later. And at that point, when we did acquisitions, legal wasn't comfortable with us doing any press at the announcement because they were worried it would leak, which is very fair. We actually did have a leak in a later acquisition, so I understand the concern. But then the problem is for PR, once the deal's closing, the news has been out for 3 months and like everyone's like, okay, we already kind of know the story. So there's not really a story here. So with SendGrid, we were like, what's the meaty personal story we can bring to the table here to have someone cover this announcement and really tell like the true, like I said, putting the face to the story. And we got Jeff and Samir together and asked like, how did this deal come together? Like, had you talked on the phone? And they started telling us this story, how they happened to be on this ski trip because they shared an investor who would take all their entrepreneurs out on a ski trip every year. And Samir was unable to come to breakfast. So, because he had a call. So Jeff was out with the rest of the entrepreneurs and he ended up buying a breakfast burrito and bringing it back to Samir's room, said, I know you missed breakfast. Here's breakfast for you. And that was like the start of their conversation. Samir said he recognized like this was someone he thought was a great guy and like maybe they would share the same values, etc. So we pitched the story of the $3 billion breakfast burrito because that was the price of the deal. And we pitched it to Forbes, who I always think is actually the best at telling the human side of stories. And he interviewed both executives, and then they ended up doing a whole story about the acquisition. And that was sort of the meat of it. It was like, that was the hook, the $3 billion breakfast burrito. But really it was an opportunity for us to tell the story of the acquisition and why the companies combined created the next vision for Twilio. So I always love that story because we had reached out to a few reporters just trying to pitch the deal close and they were like, it's out there, this isn't news. And then we pitched that part, and that got us one of our biggest stories of the year. So we always love that story and whenever we get any pushback about like trying to get the executives to tell us human interest things, we're like, remember the $3 billion breakfast burrito, our favorite story ever? So we sort of did the same thing when we acquired Segment, and we just did another story around our Signal conference. We sort of did the same thing, like, tell us the love story. How'd you two meet? How did this deal come together? And I think that's super important. And it's something that I think a lot of people aren't very comfortable, obviously, just sharing all their personal, juicy conversations, but that is what's the most interesting in the press. So we really push that, and I think it pays off.
Especially with a merger, like an acquisition, so much of it is relationship. And there is a lot of time, at least in my experience, there is a lot of time that goes into the founders or whoever meeting each other and like kind of in a way dating and courting before they actually decide to say like, okay, yes, like this deal is going to go through. So there is a lot of really good stuff that you can pull from that. And that is one of the best examples I've heard in a long time of, really being able to get like a really great origin story, out of something that normally you would look at the news cycle and be like, oh, it's out there, there's nothing we can talk about. And the reality is like, maybe that story would have never happened if you guys, if the news cycle had been slightly different. And so you didn't have the opportunity to be creative and actually kind of get to the heart.
And I think it's just memorable. You have to think of like, as a consumer of news, like everyone's not going to be interested in the technical details of every tech company out there, but you do remember the humans and the people. And so like, I always think about what story I would be interested in reading. And that's the kind of headline I would click on. So we always also like, we outline potential headlines, and this one, you very rarely guess the headline correctly, but this time we had put that as our goal headline. So
really?
We had a fun little celebration amongst our team. Like, we actually got the headline we were hoping for.
That's amazing. Good. I love that. Okay, before we jump in, I actually thought we could probably take a quick poll of the audience to try to better understand, what their biggest challenges are when it comes to thought leadership. So we're going to throw a little poll out there. If you guys could take a moment and, submit your answer, and then we'll check in on it in a little bit. So what's your biggest challenge when it comes to thought leadership? Is it educating the leaders, building the unique business proposition, identifying the right metrics, or finding interesting story angles? So go ahead and submit, and then we'll check back in shortly. Okay, well, so with that in mind, thought leadership takes time, and it takes executives time. So how have you guys gotten buy-in from executives? Like, I know that, Jeff understands the value of PR. It sounds like he's like quite bought in, so to speak, but he only has a limited amount of hours in the day to dedicate to comms. And same with your other executives who might not even be as familiar or, see the value in comms. So how have you, over the last few years, been able to kind of build up that buy-in so that it is a priority for them and they're willing to kind of commit some of their time and schedule to doing media relations?
I think that's the hardest part. It takes a true collaboration with your executives. The PR team can't do it alone, and the executive can't do it alone. You really have to be in sync to tell these stories. And I agree, in the beginning, it feels like a lot more input than output, because you're doing the relationship building and it doesn't always result in a story. So we definitely had a challenge before the IPO. I remember Jeff said, like, I'm doing all this press, but like, it's not working. And then at the IPO, we started seeing all these reporters who had met with him over the year come back and be more interested and write these stories that he had told them. So he was like, oh, I guess it did work, which is like, was a great example after. But during the time, it's very stressful when your executives like this. I don't think you guys are doing anything. So I would say my advice for that is like, set the expectation early on. In our briefing that we send to executive, we always have the first line, like, the goal of this opportunity is it coverage? Is it relationship building? Is it to get to know this reporter? And make it very clear whether or not we expect an article to result. And then we measure both. So we measure both, like at the end of each quarter, we do this thing called top 20. We've identified what we think our top 20 most influential media outlets are. And we measure how many of those outlets we've interacted with. So we've done an interview or we've planned a story or whatever. And then we also measure how many we've secured a coverage, a feature story in. So we're measuring both pieces of that pie. Like we're measuring the work that it takes to get to a story and how much progress we've made on that half. And then we're measuring the impact, like the result in the article that everyone knows. Because I think if you just measure the article or the number of pieces of coverage or the volume or something like that, you may not be getting credit for all the work you're doing. And also, I think by measuring both interaction and result, you sort of are able to tell the story better when you're reporting your results. Like, our job is both to educate the press with your help, and that's how we're doing with all these interactions, and then to get coverage and get the word out. And so you measure both pieces, and that really helps. Yeah. I think also have like examples. I've been very lucky. I have a group of peers who work in enterprise PR too, and we meet about once a month. But one of the people on that team or in that group of people had told me that she meets with her executive once a month, and the whole purpose of that is just to brainstorm ideas. And when she told me that, I'm like, oh, I don't do that. Like, I just, and so then I started setting up a one-on-one with Jeff, and the whole purpose is just, we just talk, we don't have a full agenda. We just brainstorm like what's fresh in the news, what are the macro trends, what's going on in the company, and come up with like what are our next couple pitches and storylines. And he's been very helpful. But when it was helpful to share, this executive that, this is how he works with his PR team. So sometimes having some proof points of what other companies do really is helpful. And it takes a lot of work though. Like, there's no way around it. You really have to build up. When you don't have the outcomes yet, it's harder to make your case, but you trust your strategy. And when it does start resulting in coverage, everyone starts acknowledging that the early work is paying off.
Yeah, I think that the concept of sharing the interactions versus the results, like the outcome, is so important. So much that so often, like, we only care about the end result. And then it's usually one story or a few stories, and you don't really realize like how much time went into that, and also all the kind of building blocks that you do, like establishing that credibility or that media relationship carries you well beyond that one story. You obviously draw on it for future stories, but people have really short memories, and so they don't really realize the process. And I think including the process in your performance is really important. And I would say that you're probably one of the few that I've spoken with that does that. And I think that that's so important. That's something that we talk about at Wiz the Key, is like bringing it, reporting out at various stages of the campaign, not just at the end result.
Right.
Okay, so we have our poll results back, which is great. It looks like identifying the right metrics actually is the biggest challenge.
Yes.
Yep. And then finding interesting story angles is the second hardest bit. And then educating leaders and building a unique business proposition kind of are tied for third. So why don't we talk about finding interesting story angles? I think you had said that you do these monthly intakes.
Yep.
Is there anything else you do with your team in terms of kind of identifying narratives that you think are, important for that quarter, or various
we do something that I think has made it really fun. We have gamified this process, and we call it Twilio Newsroom. And we do it with our agency once a quarter, and we act like we're the editors. I've never been in a newsroom, but this is how we assume it goes, and everyone has to come with a pitch, just like you see. We were joking, what's that, there's some rom-com that takes place in a editorial room, and every person has to go around and pitch their story, and the editor says like yes or no. But we started doing this.
Is it How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days?
Yes.
Lacey's saying How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days. Oh yeah, Mallory. Thanks, Mallory.
Yep, that's our process. But it's become really fun and kind of competitive. So each person comes with their idea, and it can be off the wall, and they come also with their media outlet, and they pitch their idea. And usually what we do is I didn't like that piece of it, but that one part was interesting. And our outcome of that is we always come with come out with 3 pitches, which is like for the quarter. That's how we work with our agency, who's been great partners to us. And we sort of make it like a game, like whose pitch wins. And if you place it, like you kind of get a shout out for placing one of the newsroom outlets. Also, I think, yeah, that's definitely one way to find interesting stories. The other thing is just like, it sounds silly, but like these intakes where you spend an hour with an executive, like we use those for a year. Like I'm constantly going back to our intake docs. We call them an intake doc, but like we put 5 prompts in there, random questions, like 2 are about their business, 2 are about macro trends, and 2 are personal questions, like about their backgrounds or their history or how they think about things. And then we just use those all year long. We always go back and think, and you can come up with so many storylines if you just spend an hour speaking to somebody, or like, you know, ask someone to get coffee, or when you walk, when you have an interview, go for a 5-minute walk before. I think learning the person, you learn so much. I can't tell you how many stories I've come up with in an Uber on the way to an interview with Jeff, just because we're just chatting casually and without any formal, like, we have to think of a story today. And then I'm like, that's interesting, we should do that. Or he'll tell me a story. So I think spending the time with your executives is super important, and they may not want to do it, but you know, if you really educate them on like the value this can bring, that's super important. And, you know, that's how all of our stories, once you start really listening, I feel like the number of stories in your company there's so many things that you don't think of as like hard news, but that can really help you get coverage. And we do that all the time.
So how have you actually been able to like, successfully add more executives to the bench? Because thought leadership isn't just, you know, Jeff and your CEO. Like, talk to us a little bit about how you've been able to like bring in other people into the fold and sort of lean on them to tell, different parts of the Twilio story.
Yeah, it's really important. And especially when you get bigger, it's important always to have more than one person that can tell your story, but especially as you get bigger, you know, Jeff's not the one that has the expertise on every single thing anymore. So that's been really fun. Like, for example, our CFO, we used to just use him for earnings. Like, he did a quick interview at earnings with a reporter to talk through the financial results. And then we started seeing in the news, people were starting to get more curious about the usage-based business model, which is how Twilio bills. It's a little bit different than SaaS, which is, you know, you pay for seats. Twilio, you pay by how much Twilio you use. So we started saying like, well, we should have Gozema out there like talking about this. So we just pitched him out to talk about the different business models in software and how they have evolved. And we ended up getting a ton of coverage. And there was like a Fortune CFO daily column that he ended up being featured in. And it was great. Cool. It was like, and you know, it gives him more confidence to go out there and be able to speak on behalf of the company, but also it shares a totally different point of view from someone who's spent his whole career in financials and can really tell that story. And then another great example is our chief people officer, Christy. Like, during the pandemic, we were getting a lot of inbounds wanting to speak to Jeff about, like, as an employer, how are you thinking about work from home, or how are you thinking about perks, or are you going to move remote? Are you going to be hybrid? How are your employees feeling? And we started asking these questions of Christy because she's really the expert on the people. And she's had a handful of different features, just sharing her perspective. And we just did this exactly what I was talking about before, like an hour-long intake, asking her like what she's hearing from managers, what she hears from employees, what are the executives talking about together, and sort of built out her profile to tell the story of Twilio as an employer during the pandemic and like how we were thinking about that, just running a company. And so we built out her point of view there. And so I think when you think about what's the most important company story to tell, we would have probably said the company vision and the product story. But once you understand what the opportunities are in the news, like if you read all the headlines, everyone was talking about remote work. And we're like, how can we be part of that story? And we found that Christy was the right person for that. So I think like you really have to know what your company story is, and then what the macro story is in the world. Just look through the headlines of a few different outlets and you'll see the trend, and ask yourself, what is there an executive at your company who could maybe speak to this? And then build up that profile. And it's really taken some of the pressure off Jeff. He can sort of stick to the stories that he knows best, which is telling this vision, and there's no one that can tell that story better than him. But it also lets us put a face to a lot of the other things that go on at the company that are also really important.
Yeah, I mean, the company is more than just one person, right? And it's a lot of people. And I think the more that you are able to spotlight the people behind the products, like we talked about earlier, the better. So much of this actually relies on finding the right reporter to tell that story, right? So let's talk a little bit about media relations,
Sure.
and how your approach is to finding sort of the right match so that you can place these amazing stories that you guys have all come up with and brainstormed in your newsroom,
Yeah.
which I love.
I think we've had to, we do a lot less embargoed pitching than we used to do. There's just less reporters, and I think they're less receptive to a pitch that 10 other outlets are going to write. We call it surgical storytelling, which just means we pick a reporter and we try to really think about what they're interested in and what they care about and what they're required to cover, and figure out if we're the right fit for them. So when we build out pitches now, it's more about picking a specific outlet and going after one reporter and saying, really read their coverage, follow them on Twitter, find their interest, and then build a story that we think can help them do their job, versus us just pitching everyone to tell our story. I think that's what sort of got us to this top 20, we call it, which is where we identified our top 20 media outlets. But we really try and each take on a specific reporter and outlet and build up the story for them, versus just going out to anyone who will write your narrative. But it takes time. We had a good Financial Times story, and
yes, I love that story.
Thank you.
One of my favorites this year.
Thank you. It published in June, which was amazing, and we all loved it. But Jeff did his first interview in January. And my agency team had pitched that story when we were doing Jeff's book tour, I think in October or November.
Wow.
So we were working on that story for close to a year, and it took a long time. It really does. And we built that relationship with the reporter over time, and gave him access to Jeff. And we all spent, both my team and I spent separate times with the reporter to really build it out. And it resulted in a great story, but that kind of story doesn't happen overnight. And you really do have to educate your executives. So when that story came out, I sent a note to our executives and I made really clear, we've actually been working on this story for 9 months, because you don't want anyone to think let's do a story here and it's going to publish in a month, because the true big features do take longer than that. And the relationship building is really important. Also, this is tactical kind of, but I think when you're on the phone with the reporter, whether it's at an interview or elsewhere, just asking them the simple question. I learned that from Jeff, because sometimes at the end of interviews, he'll just say, is there anything you're working on that we can help with? And the reporters, I think, are kind of taken aback, because I don't think we've ever asked them. But many times they're like, oh yeah, actually, I am working on this. And we'll decide if we want to participate or if we should connect them with somebody. But you can just simply ask that question. If you have a reporter, we'd love to know what you're working on or what you're focused on, or if you're running into any roadblocks with connections we can help make for you. And we've done that a lot, and I think it pays off. Yeah,
I think the more you can help them, the better, right? I always found that when I was working on media relations and the core journalists that I was talking to, it's how can I make your job easier? I want to come to you with a really great story that I really think you're going to enjoy writing and like telling. And if you're already working on something, how can we help improve it? Can we offer a perspective or connect you with somebody who is an expert in that? And I do think that that's also the two-sided relationship of, media relations, right? It's not just us coming to them.
Yeah, and you always think of there's this relationship where the reporters don't like PR people and they are tweeting about us or whatever. I've been on both sides of that, of course. But they, if you're doing your job well and you're being a good partner to them, they really do rely on you and they need your help. So if you can really be that resource and not be spamming them with news that's irrelevant to them, I do think, you can have a friendly relationship with any reporter.
How have you guys created that top 20 list? What were some of the sort of things that you thought about to sort of build that out? Is it just, top outlets that we've all heard of? Is it based on who your customers are reading, or,
It's kind of a mix. Basically, Twilio is a company built for developers. And so in the early days, we were always trying to figure out like, what do developers read? And what we found out is developers don't really read a lot of press.
Reddit.
Like we read Hacker News and Reddit. So we were like, oh God, that's not good for us. But then, you know, Twilio's other big audience is enterprise decision makers, which is kind of like a fluffy term, but it's the person making the buying decision. And we started thinking, what do they really read? And even though developers are our lifeblood and our number one audience always, because they're what bring us into companies, we also need the person who makes the buying decision to know about Twilio. And so that's where we sort of decided PR could have the most impact was influencing that audience. And so we picked our outlets based on those we think business audiences read. So they're mostly business press. And then we have a handful of tech press that we believe are also like target that audience. So they still have like a more technical, techie audience, but are also the business press. And we evaluate it every year. So we usually, I would say it's been pretty consistent, but we probably swap out one or two every year. And we have some we never have hit, like that remain like we're always like, we didn't get them again.
Buffalo.
Exactly. And we're like, we're keeping them on because we have to go get them. So that's how we do it. And I think that's really helped us a lot.
Cool. Let's actually let's do another poll to the audience. I'd love to know what the best channel to establish your thought leadership is. Like, is it trade magazines, mainstream media, podcast, or speaking opportunities, which we actually haven't touched on, but tend to be a very popular format for executives. So go ahead and submit your answer, and then we'll come back to it in just a minute. All right. So, Caitlin, when you have a good story, like, you know that you have this like amazing $3 billion burrito story and you're having trouble getting it placed, what do you do?
Yeah, that happens a lot. I would say the first thing is try a couple reporters. Like maybe you pitch somebody who can't do it for whatever reason. I think if you've tried it and gotten declined or gotten silenced 3 times, your pitch is wrong. Okay. So we'll rewrite the pitch. Like we'll say, okay, so we're missing something here. If no one's responding to this, like we didn't make this interesting enough. Like what other angles do we have for the same story? So we do that a lot. We'll rewrite pitches several times and pitch them differently and try and find a home for it. And then when in doubt, I would just like, I think especially at the agency, you're trained so well to write like a concise, like very well written, perfect grammar pitch. And that is super important, especially when you don't know the reporters yet. Like if you have a bunch of errors, like someone's gonna ignore you. But I do think sometimes that leans too much towards not speaking like a human. And so sometimes I'll say like, if someone on my team is like pitching something, or I'll ask myself this, like, okay, just explain it to me in your words. And like, oh, well, it's actually blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, okay, that's way more clear than what you wrote down in that super formal pitch. So just write that down and send that. Just speak like you're talking to a friend. I kind of joke, like my pitches are kind of stream of consciousness. Like they're not super formal. They aren't perfectly written, but they're quick and they're short and they sort of get the reporter what they need. So I do think like, rewrite your pitch if it's not working. And then don't make it too formal because like we're just people talking to people. So I think if you sort of get to the point quickly, sometimes that helps. Also, sometimes your pitch, you might think it's a great idea and it might not be a great idea. So we also like, after a while, if you get to however many no's, sometimes you just have to kill it. And we do that frequently. Like we have pitches that I think are the best idea. And I'm like, can't wait to see this story. And then, our agency, we have a great relationship with them, but they'll be honest with us. Like we got 4 no's on this, we have to kill it. I'm like, okay, I trust you. So that's definitely, sometimes you have to know when your story is not reaching.
And timing too, right? Sometimes it's just not the right time to tell that story.
Totally.
Yeah. Amazing. So I think that Twilio's you have created this amazing culture of executives feeling able to share their vulnerabilities and be human, sort of tell these personal stories, which to me feels really unique because I've worked in a fair amount of places where that was not the case, and instead the execs were more afraid of misspeaking. Right. And we are. So how do how did that kind of culture come about? What are some of the things that you've done or that your team has done or Jeff's done to kind of
Yeah.
create this sort of culture there is, good to share and find these human stories and angles among all the different executives.
I think it's something I've noticed the whole time I've worked in PR. Like, you talk to people at the company when you're just having a conversation, they are amazing storytellers. You like think they're so smart. And then sometimes you get on the phone with the reporter and they're like, can barely speak and they're nervous and they're saying like, Caitlin, can I share that? Or, whatever. And I think that there's a bit of a culture where we're as PR people, we're often so risk adverse and scared of getting a bad story that maybe we overwarn the spokesperson and then the spokespeople are scared, especially the early ones. So I always try and say like, I'm there to stop you if you start going too far or to fix it if you said the wrong thing. And like, I'm confident in my ability to do that. But you should tell the story and be as authentic and real and be as transparent as you can with certain guidelines, of course. Obviously, hopefully none of us are putting someone on the phone who's like a total wild card anyway. But I think that's a really important as like a PR team is to give your spokespeople, you have to give them the job. Like, it's your job to tell the story and tell it interesting. And that's how you get the coverage. But it's my job to make sure you don't say anything wrong. So you speak freely and I will jump in if it's wrong, versus saying like, don't say this and don't say this and don't say this. And then they're terrified and the story ends up not happening because they didn't say anything interesting. So I think that's sort of just something we all have to learn, and you have to train your spokespeople, especially early spokespeople, about that. Jeff, as a leader, is really good about talking about when we mess up. We had a BBC story recently that shared the story about when we lost our biggest customer and our stock tanked and it was a total nightmare. And he talked about that story to the BBC. Like, we're 5 years out from there, luckily, but he told the story like, this is what happened. And this was my immediate reaction, was like, whose fault is this? And then you realize if it's anyone's fault, it's everyone's fault, because there shouldn't be a single point of failure for anything. And he told the story about how we sort of do these blameless postmortems actually when something goes wrong at the company. And that ended up being a story. Like, you would have never thought of that as a PR story, but ended up being one of our big stories this year too. So I don't know. I think you kind of have to build that in your culture, ask the questions during those intakes and build that trust. But reporters as people, we all love hearing about a comeback story. So being able to share a mistake you made or like a time when you thought you couldn't come back from, I think those are great questions to ask your executives and see if that's a potential for thought leadership story.
I mean, so often we focus on the successes, which is great. We do want to share like when everything's going well, but a lot of the more interesting lessons happen when you are making mistakes or things happen that are unexpected, right? And that does make for really interesting stories, and being willing to share that is so unique and, is great for other business leaders because they certainly are facing the same challenges. Okay, so it looks like we got some of the results back from the polls. What is the best channel to establish thought leadership? So mainstream media seems to be the most popular, then trade magazines, speaking opportunities, and then podcasts. So do you find that that's also the case for you guys?
I think so. Podcasts have become a bigger deal for us. They're hard because you can't measure them as well as you can measure mainstream media. And so I think they feel like a bit more of a wild card, but I think a longer form interview, you can really show the personality of someone versus when you have, either a 5-minute broadcast interview or you're just doing print and you're getting 2 quotes in the whole story. I think hearing someone's voice and hearing the way they tell a story is really good and really impactful. We did, I can't remember if I told you this, but Jeff, my CEO, wrote a book this year, and we did some podcasts in support of that. And one of the podcasts we did actually drove the most spike in like traffic to the Amazon page or whatever after. We were like, okay, I guess podcasts are like, we had no way to measure that other than we could just see the day it came out and the sales. But, I think podcasts are becoming a way more important medium. They do take more time, but I think sometimes that also gives you as a PR person, if you listen to your executive speak for an hour, that's like doing an intake session on your own, and you can go pull from that and use that stuff over and over again.
Yeah. I find podcasts to be I don't know, undervalued resource, but I think measurement is a tricky one. It's actually something that Akriti and I have talked about a lot, is how do we measure podcasts? I remember early on, I put one of our executives on This Week in Startups, and that wound up being a huge driver for our employee brand and helping with recruiting, which was like so competitive. And I remember thinking that was a really unexpected positive outcome, was that when people would interview and they'd say, you would ask them like, how do you hear about us? They'd say, oh, we heard your CEO on This Week in Startups. And you're like, oh, cool.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
So much of the time, like work you do in PR, you can't measure. And then you hear some anecdote. We actually collect those on our team. Like when we hear a salesperson that's like, by the way, this person learned about us because they read about us in Forbes. And like, we have no way to track that, but then we can, we put that in our report, like
props.
These little sales anecdotes we heard where they've read about us, or a new employee comes in because they heard us on a podcast, exactly like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, we had one more poll, and then I wanted to get to questions for the group. So for the audience, what is the key metric that matters in creating thought leadership for your brand? Is it brand share of voice, leadership share of voice, keyword analysis, or story narrative? So let us know and we'll come back to you. Okay, Caitlin, I know that we have 10 minutes left, and I know people have some really good questions. So
yes,
few things for you that I'm curious about. What, as you look ahead, 2022, any stories that you're looking forward to sharing, in the sort of thought leadership space that you haven't gotten to already?
Yeah. We at Signal, our conference, we just announced sort of the next evolution of Twilio and revealed a new vision, which is to become the leading customer engagement platform. And for us, we're like, this is a whole new level of stories. And I'm really excited to be able to talk to our customers and get those anecdotes about how we're sort of unlocking them to have better interactions with their own consumers that they work with. So that's something I'm just excited to be able to do this year. Secondly, Twilio has taken one of our big priorities as a corporate, or at the corporate level, is to actively become an anti-racist company. And this has been a huge effort across the whole organization. What I think is cool about it is that we're not just trying to hit our diversity numbers, but we're trying to really evaluate every process of the company and put it through this anti-racist framework that our chief diversity and inclusion officer came up with. Cool. And I'm excited about that because our approach from being public about this is to really reveal how we're doing, whether that's good or bad, and where we're falling short, so that other companies can learn from us going through the process. So I'm excited to tell that story. I think it's a very sensitive story that, it's nerve-wracking to reveal that, but I'm glad the company is excited to do that. And so I think that's a big opportunity for us, is to sort of not lead the way, but share how we're doing, whether we do a good job or not. And hopefully in the long tail of this is we'll be able to show our progress and reveal that for everybody else to be able to follow.
That sounds like an incredible challenge, and I'm actually really looking forward to seeing what comes out of it. Because I could imagine that most people would be afraid to get that headline of like, X company is racist, right? And so to be able to be so open and kind of transparent about how we're trying to make improvements and move into a place that is more diverse, and that it's like, a cultural shift, and that it's all part of the entire business, I think is, versus checking these boxes, I think is so important. I
think in the tech industry, we all have so much work to do, and there's nobody there's no one to point to right now that we can say they're doing an incredible job here. So we hope one day we're that company, but we're going to share the process
along the way. That's good. Okay, well, let's jump into, we've got some really great questions. Oh wait, actually first, last poll results are in, so let's check that out first. Well, okay, the key metric looks like brand share of voice is the biggest one. No one is doing leadership share of voice, story narratives, and then keyword analysis. Interesting. Okay. I do think that kind of goes back to that brand halo that you were talking about at the beginning of our conversation. Okay, well, we have some really great questions. Actually, a couple center around the relationship with your agency, which it sounds like you guys have this great relationship with, your executives. You also have a really good working relationship with your agency. So can you talk a little bit more about like the division of, responsibility? Like, do you pitch versus your agency? Kind of, what does that sort of look like? How do you manage them?
Yeah. It's funny because in the early days, I was our team was so small and at one point I was the only person on the PR team for a very short time, but the agency sort of became my team and I really thought of them as that. So we were very collaborative in pitching and we still are. It's scaled a bit. And I would say the agency is probably doing 80% of our actual media outreach.
Okay.
But in terms of developing the storylines, we're doing a lot of collaboration on that. Like I said, we always do these quarterly media newsrooms, and we spend a lot of our calls each week really brainstorming and talking through story ideas. But I think the best relationships or the best working relationship with an agency is when you think of yourselves as one team. And we definitely do that. We've had different team members, interface directly with our executives. We have them interact with people inside the company. We don't want to be gatekeepers to that because I think the more they hear the story firsthand, the better, because then they can, tell the best stories. So we use Highwire PR in the US, and we've used them longer than I've been at Twilio. So they've been here for our whole journey.
Nice.
And we really work as like one big team. I would say I'm having my team internally do more of the hunting of stories and surfacing those, and the agency's doing more of the pitching. But I also think if you're not pitching, getting turned down, you're going to forget how hard it is. So everyone on my team also pitches on the internal side too.
That is a good muscle to keep kind of flexing.
Yes.
As we've moved remote, actually, you don't get that sort of face-to-face interaction with execs quite the same way as you probably used to before, going from meeting to meeting or catching them and grabbing a coffee. So do you have any tips on how you kind of are like still interacting with executives in this new sort of remote work world? Or if, if you have people that are not based in the same city, but need to kind of get sort of some interactions with executives, like how they can do that?
Yeah, if you can just put 30 minutes on their calendar, like once a month, and have, you might have your own pitch ideas that you bring forward and ask them their takes. But just have some time to chat and have some prompts ready just to develop storylines. Sometimes it's hard to get on their calendars, but like you need that in a remote environment to keep the PR train going. So I think just really doing, making sure you're getting that FaceTime, even if it's on Zoom, is super important. Also, like making sure you're over clarifying your results. We do this sort of silly thing, but we send out an internal press release on our PR results each quarter. We write it like a press release, but it's like what we did. It's kind of funny, but people like it because it's sort of
I would love to see that.
We write a headline, we write 3 subheads, and I think that it makes people read it versus, you get those long emails that are like scrolling from each team. We just make it a short press release of like our big wins and and then we put what we care about for the next quarter. So I think that's sort of a fun way to do it. Just, use your PR creativity to sort of get the word out. But I think that FaceTime, I think that's really critical. And if you're getting shut down, push for it, because I think 30 minutes of an executive's time sharing their perspective on the company and the macro environment is so helpful.
Yeah, I think that is. So I know you had talked a little bit about, I love that internal press release. I think we should all kind of borrow that.
I can share with the line. People want to see it, you can reach out to me.
I think that'd be great. I know you had talked a little bit about how you kind of have this peer group of other comms people in the enterprise space that have been a really great resource for you. Do you have any other good resources for finding opportunities for thought leadership that might be worth this sharing?
I think I follow all the tech reporters on Twitter. My Twitter is probably a pretty boring place for someone that doesn't work in tech PR, but you do hear their commentary and you hear what they're caring about. I think that's super important, is follow them on Twitter. I would say that's like most of the time where I find a reporter and I'm like, oh, he's been talking about this a lot. We should reach out to he or she about this topic.
Yeah.
Where else do we go? I think just reading the news, going to look at your peers and where they're being featured. There's also a great Facebook group for internal comms people that people often share different opportunities. It's been really valuable for me. Yeah.
Yes, we're both in it. I find that group very, yeah.
I love
yeah.
that group.
I love
Super
that group
helpful.
too. Have you noticed any like common mistakes that brands do while building out their thought leadership?
Probably taking on too many topics,
Okay.
especially
Yep.
when you're small. Like you have to get really like, if you try and have a point of view on everything, I see this a lot on social issues, actually. Like a company has a statement on every single thing that happens, which like, I understand the pressure to do that. But I think if you can be more targeted about what your company's soul is and the topics you care about, that's where you can have real impact. And so I think that's probably, if I think of any mistake, it's just speaking out about too much. And, the other thing is just being authentic. Like that's, if there's anything I notice the most, is when I think something reads like a marketing statement versus just a real point of view from an executive. And that's the beauty of thought leadership, is you're dealing with a person. So you can be more human about it.
Yeah. Okay, in our last minute, any final pieces of advice for this group?
My best advice is, when it comes to the marketing, all the marketing disciplines, PR is the best bang for your buck. So when you get pushback on it being expensive compared to like an advertising budget or a marketing budget, it is so cheap. So just really, making that comparison, I think it's hard because it's so much harder to measure, but the impact of PR is huge. And it really is something that every company that's investing in marketing should be having top of their list, because you get a lot out of it. So that would be my one thing, is really asking that question when you get pushback on budget. I always do. And then my other thing is just finding your group of people that do your same job, and really using them. Like I have a group of PR people, and we meet once a month, and we just talk about what our challenges are, stories we're pitching, or what's working or what's not working. And I get so much value out of that group. And I just think that's important, to have peers that are doing your same work day to day. And I learn a lot from them. And, we've actually out of that been able to build some programs together and get our executives to do like a media dinner or something like that, which is fun.
Oh, amazing.
But yeah, find your people.
Find your people. I agree. That's kind of what we're sort of trying to do here too. Well,
I know, this is great. Also, quickly to answer I see Corey's question. I would say hire a consultant.
Agree. I second that. All right. Well, we have hit the end of our conversation. Caitlin, thank you so much for joining us and giving us all your insights on thought leadership. I have really enjoyed the conversation. I feel like what you've provided is so insightful, and definitely would say that Twilio is definitely, the best in business in terms of best practices for thought leadership. So we are so fortunate to have you today. For those of you in the audience that joined us and are new to WizAKey, and you are, curious about what we're doing here and the sort of platform that we're building and the PR community that we're creating, feel free to email me at sarah@wizakey.com. This session's been recorded, so we'll make sure to share it if you weren't able to join for the whole time. And then if you have any other questions, want to know about some of the things we've talked about, such as the Facebook group that we mentioned, or Caitlin's internal, press release, happy to share that after. So feel free to just email us.
Yep. Feel free to reach out. I'm always, I had a lot of people earlier in my career that I leaned on heavily. So I'm always happy to do that for anyone as well.
Thank you. That was a wonderful talk. Some fantastic insights and fantastic examples. A lot to learn, a lot of things to apply practically, very practical experiences, Caitlin and Sarah, that you got out of the conversation. Thank you so much for this. And I cannot thank you enough. And the audience, I saw that a lot of us were just hanging on the conversation all through. And now people must have left for their other meetings, because we've just overshot by 2 minutes, but this was fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
It was great having you on this.
Yeah.
Thanks for organizing.
Yeah. For those of you in the US, happy Thanksgiving. Hope you guys have a really relaxing week. We have another webinar coming up in December, so we'll share more details on that. But until then, thanks again and have a great day.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye. Bye, everyone.